March 31, 1945. Over the Ruhr Valley, Germany. Second Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson's P-47 Thunderbolt shuddered as the first 20mm cannon shell exploded against his right wing. At 22,000 feet above the industrial heartland of Nazi Germany, he was alone. Separated from his squadron during a savage dogfight with a swarm of Focke-Wulf 190s. The spring sun glinted off his oil-streaked canopy as a second shell tore through his tail section, ripping away chunks of aluminum and fabric. Johnson had been flying combat missions for 7 months. He knew the sound of his aircraft being hit, the metallic tearing, the explosive crack of cannon shells, the whistling rush of wind through new holes in the fuselage. But nothing in his training had prepared him for what was happening now. A Focke-Wulf 190 had latched onto his tail with predatory precision, and its pilot, clearly an experienced ace, was methodically destroying Johnson's Thunderbolt piece by piece. Tracer rounds walked up the fuselage toward the cockpit. Johnson threw the massive fighter into a banking turn, but the P-47 responded sluggishly. The controls felt mushy. Something was wrong with the hydraulics. Another burst of cannon fire. This time, shells punched through the engine cowling. Black smoke erupted from beneath the cowl flaps. Oil sprayed across the windscreen, turning the world into a brown blur. The engine temperature gauge climbed into the red zone. His instrument panel looked like a Christmas tree of warning lights, every system screaming that the aircraft was dying beneath him. The FW-190 closed to less than 100 yards. Johnson could see the German pilot's leather helmet, the black crosses on the wings, the muzzle flashes from the cannons mounted in the nose. At this range, the German couldn't miss, and he didn't. Shell after shell hammered into the Thunderbolt's fuselage, wings, and tail. The cockpit filled with the smell of cordite and burning oil. Pieces of equipment flew off the instrument panel. The stick shook violently in Johnson's hands. He tried to dive away, the standard escape maneuver for the heavy Thunderbolt. But when he pushed the stick forward, nothing happened. The elevator controls were shot to pieces. He couldn't climb. He couldn't dive properly. He could barely turn. The P-47 was flying like a brick with half its flight surfaces destroyed, and the FW-190 was still behind him, still shooting, still tearing his aircraft apart. Johnson's left hand fumbled for the canopy release. Every fighter pilot knew the rule. When your aircraft is this badly damaged, you bail out. You don't stay in a flying coffin waiting for a bullet to find you, or for the engine to explode. The German pilot was giving him no choice. Another burst stitched across the fuselage, so close that Johnson felt the impacts through his seat. But when he reached for the canopy jettison handle, something made him pause. The engine, despite the smoke and damage, was still running. The instruments, despite the shattered panel, still showed readings. The controls, despite being shot up, still responded. Barely, but they responded. And deep in Johnson's gut, beneath the terror and the instinct to abandon the dying aircraft, a thought crystallized. This thing is still flying. The FW-190 made one final gun run, expending the last of its ammunition in a sustained burst that raked the Thunderbolt from tail to nose. Johnson counted 17 separate impacts. Then, with its guns empty, the German fighter pulled alongside for a moment, close enough that Johnson could see the pilot looking at him through the canopy. The German pilot saluted. Then he peeled away and dove toward the deck, disappearing into the haze below. Johnson was alone at 15,000 feet in an aircraft that looked like it had been through a metal shredder. Every warning light on his panel was illuminated. The engine was running rough, coughing black smoke. The windscreen was almost completely obscured by oil. He couldn't see forward, could barely see to the sides, and had no idea if his landing gear would extend when he needed it. But the engine was still running, and the wings, despite hundreds of holes, were still generating lift. And when Johnson gingerly tested the controls, the Thunderbolt, bleeding hydraulic fluid and trailing smoke, responded. What Robert Johnson didn't know in that moment, nursing his dying fighter toward friendly lines with nothing but prayers and muscle, was that he was about to become the living proof of a claim that Republic Aviation had made about the P-47 Thunderbolt. A claim that many pilots had laughed at, that critics had dismissed as corporate propaganda, that even fellow airmen had considered an exaggeration. The claim was simple. The Thunderbolt could survive damage that would destroy any other fighter aircraft in the sky. It could absorb punishment that should kill both the plane and the pilot. It could be shot to pieces and still bring its pilot home. And in the next 45 minutes, as Johnson coaxed his shattered fighter across 90 miles of hostile German territory, he would prove that claim wasn't propaganda at all. It was simple truth. And that truth would change how American fighter pilots thought about their aircraft, about tactics, about survival itself. This is the story of how the P-47 Thunderbolt went from being mocked as too big, too heavy, too clumsy, to becoming the most feared and respected fighter bomber of World War II. It's the story of how American engineering philosophy, building things tough rather than elegant, saved thousands of pilots' lives. And it's the story of one specific mission where a single Thunderbolt took more battle damage than any aircraft in history and still landed safely, proving that sometimes survival beats performance. To understand why pilots initially laughed at the P-47 Thunderbolt, you need to understand what fighter pilots in 1942 thought a fighter should be. The ideal was the Spitfire, graceful, nimble, light, an aircraft that responded to thought as much as stick pressure. British and American pilots who flew Spitfires spoke about them with almost romantic reverence. The Spitfire weighed about 5,000 pounds empty and could turn inside anything the Germans had. It was beautiful in the way that racehorses are beautiful, bred for speed and agility, every pound carefully allocated, every design choice optimized for performance. Then, in early 1943, American pilots destined for the European theater saw their assigned aircraft for the first time, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, and their jaws dropped. Not in admiration, in horror. The P-47 weighed 10,000 pounds empty, literally twice as much as a Spitfire. It was huge, bulky. The fuselage was barrel-shaped, earning it the immediate nickname the Jug, short for Juggernaut, though some less charitable pilots suggested it looked like a milk jug with wings. Where the Spitfire had elegant elliptical wings, the Thunderbolt had straight wings that looked agricultural. Where the Spitfire had a sleek inline engine, the Thunderbolt had a massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double-wasp radial engine that required an enormous cowling. Pilots coming from training in nimble fighters like the P-40 or P-51 couldn't believe they were expected to fight the Luftwaffe in this flying bathtub. The cockpit sat so far back on the fuselage that forward visibility was terrible. The aircraft was slow to accelerate. It turned like a freight train, and early models had a tendency to wallow in turbulence like a boat in rough seas. Second Lieutenant Quince Brown, arriving at his first P-47 squadron in England, wrote home to his family, "They've given us aircraft that look like pregnant whales with guns. I don't see how we're supposed to dogfight Messerschmitts in these things. I'd rather have a Spitfire, or even a P-40. At least those can turn." The mockery was universal. British pilots, whose Spitfires could dance circles around the lumbering American fighter, made jokes about American engineering. "You Americans do everything big," one RAF pilot quipped at a joint airfield. "Big cars, big refrigerators, and now big clumsy fighters. When you discover finesse, let us know." Even the Germans weren't impressed initially. Luftwaffe intelligence reports from early P-47 encounters described the aircraft as heavy and unmaneuverable, and advised German pilots to engage in turning combat where the Thunderbolt's weight would be a fatal disadvantage. The new American fighter can be defeated through standard maneuvering tactics. One captured Luftwaffe tactical memo read, "Its size and weight make it vulnerable in the turning fight." What neither the critics nor the Germans understood was that Republic Aviation's chief designer, Alexander Kartveli, hadn't been trying to build a dog fighter at all. He had been trying to build something else entirely, a fighter that could survive. Kartveli was a Georgian immigrant who had watched Europe tear itself apart in World War I. He understood that aerial combat wasn't a gentleman's duel where the best pilot in the best turning aircraft always won. It was chaos. It was ambush and luck, and whether your aircraft could absorb punishment long enough for you to escape or fight back. He designed the P-47 around a radical philosophy: armor and toughness over elegance and agility. The Thunderbolt's massive size wasn't a design flaw. It was deliberate. That barrel-shaped fuselage allowed Kartveli to wrap the cockpit in armor plating. The pilot sat in a bathtub of quarter-inch steel that could stop rifle-caliber rounds and even deflect some cannon shells. The seat back had another layer of armor. Even the canopy frame was reinforced beyond standard specifications. The huge Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine wasn't just powerful. It was surrounded by systems designed for redundancy. Dual ignition, multiple fuel pumps, oil systems that could function even with massive leaks. The engine was mounted in a way that allowed it to absorb impacts without immediately failing. And in front of that engine sat a massive four-bladed propeller that could act as a shield, literally chopping enemy rounds out of the air before they reached critical systems. The wings weren't elegant because they didn't need to be. They were massively strong, designed to handle stress loads that would tear lighter fighters apart. The main spar could survive direct hits from cannon shells. The fuel tanks were self-sealing, surrounded by protective foam and positioned away from the cockpit, so that even if they ruptured and burned, the pilot had a chance to escape. The landing gear was absurdly overbuilt, designed to handle carrier landings, even though the P-47 was never intended for carrier operations. This meant it could take violent landings on damaged airfields, belly landings on rough terrain, and controlled crashes that would have folded lighter fighters like aluminum foil. But none of this impressed pilots who just wanted an aircraft that could turn with a Messerschmitt. The P-47's reputation reached rock bottom in the spring of 1943, when the first squadrons deployed to England. Pilots complained, commanders worried, and in mock dogfights against Spitfires, the Thunderbolt performed exactly as poorly as its critics expected. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what you know about the P-47 Thunderbolt. Drop a comment below and let me know if you'd heard this story before. And if you're enjoying these deep dives into World War II history, hit that subscribe button. These stories take serious research to get the details right, and knowing you're out there makes it all worthwhile. The transformation began not in training, but in actual combat over Europe in the summer of 1943. The 56th Fighter Group, commanded by Colonel Hubert Zemke, was one of the first P-47 units to fly bomber escort missions deep into Germany. Zemke was a pragmatic commander who understood that complaining about the aircraft they had was pointless. They weren't getting Spitfires, they had Thunderbolts, so they needed to figure out how to use them effectively. On their early missions, Zemke's pilots made a crucial discovery. While the P-47 couldn't turn with German fighters, it could do something else brilliantly. It could dive like a meteor. The Thunderbolt's enormous weight, the same weight that made it sluggish in turns, gave it incredible dive performance. In a steep dive, the P-47 could reach speeds approaching 500 mph, faster than any German fighter could match. And unlike lighter aircraft that would shake themselves apart at those speeds, the Thunderbolt's overbuilt airframe just absorbed the stress. Zemke developed new tactics around this characteristic. P-47 pilots would maintain altitude advantage, diving on German fighters from above in high-speed attack runs. They would make one gun pass, then use their momentum to zoom back up to altitude before the German fighters could respond. If a German tried to follow them into the dive, the FW-190 or Bf-109 would reach its structural speed limits while the Thunderbolt was just getting started. This boom and zoom tactic played to the Thunderbolt's strengths: speed, altitude performance, and structural toughness. It avoided the P-47's weakness, turning combat, and it started producing results. Kill ratios improved. P-47 pilots started surviving missions that should have killed them. But the real revelation came when pilots discovered what happened when things went wrong. Captain Walter Cook of the 78th Fighter Group found himself in exactly the situation every pilot feared. Jumped by 4 Bf-109s at low altitude, where he couldn't use the Thunderbolt's diving advantage. The German fighters got behind him and opened fire with cannons and machine guns. Cook felt impacts all along his aircraft. Holes appeared in the wings. The canopy shattered. Instruments exploded on his panel. Any other fighter would have gone down, but Cook's Thunderbolt kept flying. He managed to turn toward friendly lines, his aircraft shedding pieces but still generating lift, the engine still running despite visible damage to the cowling. The Bf-109s, low on fuel and ammunition, broke off the attack. Cook limped home and landed at his base with over 200 documented bullet and shrapnel holes in his aircraft. The ground crew counted the damage and stared in disbelief. The Thunderbolt had been hit in the wings, fuselage, tail, and engine. Hydraulic lines were severed. Control cables were damaged. The radio was destroyed. But every critical system had either survived or had backup systems that kept functioning. Cook walked away without a scratch, protected by the armor that surrounded his cockpit. Word spread through the fighter groups. The P-47 could take punishment. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Gabreski, who would become the top-scoring P-47 ace in Europe with 28 victories, began deliberately using the aircraft's toughness as a tactical advantage. He would press attacks closer than pilots in lighter fighters dared, knowing that if he took return fire, his Thunderbolt could absorb it. He survived multiple missions where his aircraft came home riddled with holes, the engine smoking, the controls barely responding, but still flying. The turnaround in pilot opinion was dramatic. By late 1943, pilots who had mocked the Thunderbolt as the 7-ton milk jug were calling it the unbreakable jug, with genuine affection and respect. The aircraft that had seemed like a cruel joke was revealing itself to be something unprecedented, a fighter that could be shot to pieces and still complete its mission. German pilots began to notice too. Luftwaffe combat reports from late 1943 and early 1944 show growing frustration with the Thunderbolt. Multiple hits observed on enemy aircraft with no visible effect, one report noted. Heavy fighter continues attacking despite damage. German pilots who had initially welcomed engagements with the clumsy American fighter were now trying to avoid them, aware that destroying a P-47 required far more ammunition and more prolonged attacks than any other Allied fighter. The aircraft's reputation for toughness wasn't just about armor and redundant systems. It was about the pilot's growing confidence. When you know your aircraft can take hits and keep flying, you fight differently. You press attacks harder. You don't break off at the first sign of return fire. You're willing to take risks because you trust that even if things go wrong, your aircraft will give you a chance to survive. But the ultimate proof of the Thunderbolt's legendary durability came on a spring day in 1945, when Robert Johnson's P-47 was attacked by that persistent FW-190 pilot and survived what should have been impossible. When the German fighter finally broke off its attack and disappeared, Johnson was left alone with a dying aircraft and 90 miles of hostile territory between him and friendly lines. The first challenge was simply maintaining altitude. The Thunderbolt was losing hydraulic pressure, which meant the controls were getting heavier by the minute. Johnson's arms ached from wrestling the stick. Every control input required his full strength, and the aircraft responded sluggishly, wallowing through the air like a wounded animal. The engine was still running, but barely. The temperature gauge showed the cylinder heads approaching failure temperatures. Oil pressure was dropping. Black smoke poured from beneath the cowling, streaming back over the wings. Johnson could smell burning oil and something else, a sickly, sweet smell that he realized was coolant, leaking from the shattered cooling system. He couldn't see forward. The windscreen was completely obscured by oil and hydraulic fluid. He could only see to the sides through the intact portions of the canopy, which weren't many. The 20mm shells had shattered most of the plexiglass, and wind howled through the cockpit. His maps had been sucked out through the holes. His radio was dead, the equipment smashed by shell fragments. Johnson was flying on instinct and memory, using glimpses of terrain through the side panels to navigate. He recognized the Rhine River ahead, the boundary between occupied territory and the Allied lines. But the Rhine was still 40 miles away, and every minute the Thunderbolt's condition deteriorated. The engine began running rough, coughing and missing. Johnson reduced power, trying to baby it along. But reducing power meant losing altitude. The P-47 began a slow descent from 15,000 feet. At 12,000 feet, warning lights showed that 2 of the 18 cylinders had failed completely. At 10,000 feet, oil pressure dropped to nearly zero. Any textbook on aviation would say that an engine running without oil pressure should seize within minutes, the pistons welding themselves to the cylinder walls in a catastrophic failure. But the Pratt & Whitney R2800 wasn't a textbook engine. It was overbuilt and over-engineered, designed with tolerances that allowed it to run even under conditions that should have destroyed it. Johnson coaxed it along, adjusting mixture and prop pitch, finding the exact combination of settings that kept the engine firing on its remaining 14 cylinders. The Thunderbolt descended through 8,000 feet, then 6,000. Ahead, he glimpsed the Rhine, a silver ribbon reflecting the afternoon sun. Then German anti-aircraft fire began tracking him. Flak batteries along the river opened up, throwing black puffs of exploding shells into the air around the crippled Thunderbolt. Johnson couldn't maneuver aggressively to evade. The damaged controls wouldn't respond fast enough. He could only continue his shallow descent and hope the German gunner's aim was off. One flak burst exploded close enough to pepper the underside of the fuselage with shrapnel. Johnson felt the impacts through the floor. More warning lights illuminated. Now the landing gear system was damaged. The hydraulic pump for the gear was located in the lower fuselage, exactly where the shrapnel had hit. At 4,000 feet, Johnson crossed the Rhine. He was over friendly territory now, but the ordeal wasn't over. He needed to land this aircraft, and he had no idea if the landing gear would extend. The manual extension system required hydraulic pressure that he didn't have. He might have to belly land this wreck, which in the Thunderbolt's current condition might tear the aircraft apart on impact. The engine chose that moment to fail completely. 2 more cylinders seized, then another. Suddenly, Johnson was flying a glider. A 10,000-pound glider, with the aerodynamic efficiency of a brick. The propeller windmilled uselessly in the slipstream. The cockpit went quiet, except for the wind rushing through the hundreds of holes. Johnson could see an airfield ahead. One of the emergency landing strips the Allies had bulldozed in captured territory. He aimed for it, trading his remaining altitude for distance. At 2,000 feet, he began his approach. At 1,000 feet, he reached down and pulled the emergency gear extension handle, praying that somehow the mechanism would work. Nothing happened. The landing gear indicators remained dark. No gear down and locked lights. Johnson pulled the handle again, harder. Still nothing. He was going to have to belly land. At 500 feet, with the runway filling his side windows, Johnson heard a mechanical grinding sound. Then, impossibly, one of the landing gear lights flickered green. The right main gear had extended. A second later, the left main gear light illuminated. Both main wheels were down. But the nose gear indicator stayed dark. The nose gear was still retracted, or partially retracted, or damaged. Johnson would be landing on the 2 main wheels with the nose unsupported. When the nose dropped after touchdown, it would hit the runway hard. At best, it would tear up the runway and destroy the propeller. At worst, it could cause the aircraft to cartwheel and explode. Johnson was out of altitude and out of options. The runway was directly ahead. He pulled back on the stick, fighting to keep the nose up, and felt the main wheels kiss the concrete. The Thunderbolt settled onto the runway, rolling on its 2 main gears. Johnson held the nose up as long as possible, letting the aircraft slow. At about 40 mph, gravity won. The nose dropped. Instead of hitting hard, it settled almost gently. The nose gear had partially extended after all, just enough to provide some support. The damaged tire shredded immediately, and the wheel rim ground into the concrete in a shower of sparks. But the aircraft didn't cartwheel. It didn't explode. The Thunderbolt rolled to a stop in the middle of the runway. Bleeding fluids, trailing smoke. Looking like a prop from a disaster movie. Johnson sat in the cockpit for a long moment, his hands shaking, unable to believe he was on the ground and alive. Then he popped the canopy, or what was left of it, and climbed out onto the wing. That's when he saw the full extent of the damage. The ground crew that swarmed Johnson's Thunderbolt couldn't believe what they were seeing. The aircraft looked like it had been used for target practice. Holes covered every surface. The wings looked like Swiss cheese. You could literally see through them in places. The fuselage had been stitched with cannon shells from tail to nose. The engine cowling had been blown completely off on one side. They began counting the hits. Every hole in the skin, every penetration of the structure, every severed cable and shattered component. The count climbed steadily, 500 hits, then 1,000, then 2,000. When they finished their survey 3 days later, the official damage report documented 3,056 separate hits from machine gun rounds, cannon shells, and shrapnel. The aircraft had been struck by 20mm cannon shells at least 47 times. 7 different hydraulic lines had been severed. 18 of the 20 control cables had been damaged or destroyed. Both ailerons were held on by a single attachment point each. The rudder was more whole than metal. The engine had 4 cannon shell holes through the cylinder block. 3 cylinders had been completely destroyed. The oil tank had been punctured in 5 places. The coolant system had been shattered. By every engineering principle, that engine should have seized within 30 seconds of taking that kind of damage. But it had run for 45 more minutes and carried Johnson 90 miles to safety. The armor plating around Johnson's cockpit had stopped 14 rounds that would have killed him instantly. One 20mm shell had struck the armor directly behind his head and been deflected away, leaving a crater in the steel, but not penetrating. Another had hit the armored windscreen frame and shattered, spraying fragments that would have blinded or killed Johnson if not for that reinforced structure. Engineers from Republic Aviation were flown in to examine the wreck. They took measurements, photographed the damage, and interviewed Johnson extensively. Then they shipped the entire aircraft back to the Republic factory in Farmingdale, New York. The wrecked P-47 was put on display in the factory floor with a simple sign: "This is why we build them tough." For the next year, as new Thunderbolts rolled off the production line, workers could walk past Johnson's aircraft and see exactly why every rivet mattered, why every redundant system was worth the weight penalty, why the armor added around the cockpit would save lives. Productivity in the factory increased. Workers understood that they weren't just building aircraft, they were building lifeboats for pilots flying through hell. Johnson's mission became legendary throughout the 8th Air Force. His story was told and retold in briefing rooms and pilots' barracks. The joke that pilots used to make, calling the P-47 the flying milk jug, took on a new meaning. Now, it wasn't mockery. It was affection for an aircraft that wouldn't quit, wouldn't break, wouldn't give up even when it should have fallen out of the sky in pieces. The psychological impact on American pilots was enormous. Knowing that your aircraft could survive that kind of punishment changed how you fought. P-47 pilots began pressing attacks that pilots in lighter fighters wouldn't dare attempt. They would strafe heavily defended targets, fly through flak barrages, and engage multiple enemy fighters simultaneously, confident that even if they took hits, the Thunderbolt would get them home. German pilots noticed the change. Luftwaffe reports from mid-1945 describe American Thunderbolt pilots as aggressive to the point of recklessness, and note that the P-47 groups were achieving disproportionate success because they refused to break off attacks. The Germans understood what was happening. American pilots trusted their aircraft in a way that gave them a decisive advantage in the chaos of combat. By the end of the war in Europe, the P-47 Thunderbolt had flown more than 546,000 combat sorties, more than any other American fighter. It had destroyed 7,067 enemy aircraft in aerial combat and another 9,000 on the ground. But more importantly, it had the lowest loss rate of any American fighter operating over Europe. The statistics were stunning. For every P-47 lost in combat, American pilots destroyed nearly 3 enemy aircraft. The survival rate for P-47 pilots was significantly higher than for pilots flying lighter, more elegant fighters. When a P-47 was hit by enemy fire, the pilot had a 90% chance of making it back to friendly territory. For comparison, pilots in lighter fighters had about a 60% survival rate after taking serious battle damage. The aircraft that pilots had initially mocked as too big and too clumsy ended up saving more American lives than any other fighter of the war. Its toughness became the stuff of legend. Stories circulated of P-47s returning with entire cylinder heads blown off the engine, still running on the remaining cylinders. Of Thunderbolts landing with control surfaces hanging by cables, the primary control mechanisms shot away. Of pilots walking away from aircraft that looked like they had been through industrial shredders. Captain Walker Bud Mahurin, the first P-47 ace, survived being shot down twice, both times because his Thunderbolt absorbed catastrophic damage, but stayed controllable long enough for him to reach friendly territory and belly land. After the war, he said, "The P-47 gave you a fighting chance even when everything went to hell. That's all any pilot can ask for." The Thunderbolt's philosophy of toughness over elegance influenced American military aircraft design for decades after the war. The A-10 Thunderbolt missiles, designed in the 1970s as a close air support aircraft, was named in honor of the P-47 and adopted the same design philosophy. Build it tough enough to survive intense ground fire and bring the pilot home. The A-10's titanium bathtub armor protecting the cockpit is a direct descendant of the P-47's armored cockpit design. Even in modern fighter design, where stealth and agility dominate, American aircraft still tend to prioritize survivability features that other nations' designs might sacrifice for performance. That philosophy can be traced directly back to Alexander Kartveli and the Thunderbolt, the aircraft that proved that sometimes the best fighter isn't the one that turns fastest, but the one that refuses to die. Robert S. Johnson survived the war with 7 confirmed aerial victories and returned home to California. He kept a photograph of his battle-damaged P-47 on his desk for the rest of his life. When people asked about it, he would say simply, "That airplane saved my life. It shouldn't have flown, but it did. It shouldn't have made it home, but it did. It kept its promises." Johnson died in 1998 at the age of 78, having lived more than 50 years beyond that March day when he should have died over Germany. He attended P-47 reunions regularly and always made a point of thanking the Republic aviation workers he met there. The people who had built his Thunderbolt tough enough to survive 3,056 hits and still bring him home. The wreckage of his specific P-47, the one that survived the legendary mission, was eventually scrapped after its display tour. Republic Aviation kept detailed photographs and the official damage report, but the physical aircraft was recycled for the war effort. However, the report documenting the 3,056 hits is preserved in the National Air and Space Museum archives, a testament to what remains the most battle-damaged aircraft to ever land safely in the history of military aviation. Today, restored P-47 Thunderbolts still fly at air shows around the world. They're painted in the colors of famous aces and historic squadrons. When they roar overhead with their massive radial engines thundering, spectators feel the ground shake. The P-47 doesn't have the grace of a Spitfire or the sleek deadliness of a Mustang. It looks exactly like what it is: 7 tons of American steel built to absorb punishment and dish it back out. That's exactly what Alexander Kartveli intended. He designed an aircraft that wouldn't win beauty contests, but would win the only contest that mattered: keeping pilots alive. The lesson of the P-47 extends far beyond aviation. In every field, engineering, business, warfare, life itself, there's a constant tension between elegance and durability, between performance and reliability, between doing things beautifully and doing things robustly enough to survive when everything goes wrong. The Thunderbolt represents a philosophy: build things tough enough to survive their worst day, not just perform well on their best day. Make redundancy a feature, not a bug. Accept weight penalties and complexity if they mean your users come home alive. Optimization is valuable, but survivability is priceless. Fighter pilots in 1943 laughed at the P-47 because it didn't match their preconceptions of what a fighter should be. It was too heavy, too big, too ungainly. It couldn't dance with a Spitfire or turn with a Zero. But by 1945, those same pilots were calling it the finest fighter bomber ever built, precisely because it embraced different priorities. The P-47 couldn't outturn German fighters, but it could outsurvive them. And in the brutal mathematics of aerial combat, survival counted more than grace. Every pilot who belly-landed a shot-up Thunderbolt in a French field understood that truth viscerally. Every ground crew member who counted holes in a returned P-47 and marveled that it still flew grasped it intellectually. The Thunderbolt could be shot full of holes, 3,056 holes, and still fly, still fight, still bring its pilot home. That wasn't a design flaw. That was the design working exactly as intended. They laughed at the P-47 Thunderbolt when they first saw it. This huge, heavy, ungainly fighter that seemed to embody every wrong choice an aircraft designer could make. They stopped laughing when they saw what it could survive. And by the end of the war, they weren't calling it the flying milk jug anymore. At least, not as an insult. They were calling it the unbreakable jug, the juggernaut, the aircraft that refused to die, the fighter that brought you home no matter what. Robert Johnson proved that on March 31, 1945, flying a Thunderbolt that should have killed him, but instead carried him to safety through sheer refusal to quit. That day, and 1,000 others like it, the P-47 and Thunderbolt earned a reputation that no amount of marketing could have created. The toughest fighter aircraft ever built. Sometimes survival beats performance. Sometimes tough beats graceful. And sometimes the aircraft everyone laughs at becomes the one everyone wants to fly.